All right, well, good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are watching from right now. A couple of years ago, I ran a series in Normandy and have been back several times since then. And in that series, I had the opportunity to hit a bunch of different parts of the D-Day landing beaches with Paul Woodage from World War II TV. And as an American on this side of the Atlantic, we get a lot of exposure to the things that happened on Omaha Beach and in the American airborne sector and things like that. What we don't really get as much access to is what happened in the British and Canadian sectors. So one of the things that really captivated me during that trip was traveling to Juno and Gold and Sword with Paul Woodage and learning a little bit more about the bigger picture of what happened on D-Day. And I'm always trying to, prepare a little bit before I go. And you can find all kinds of information and resources on Omaha Beach and the airborne landings and things like that. One sector that was a little bit of a struggle for me was finding information on Sword Beach. Well, today we have a gentleman with us named Stephen Fischer who has written a new book on Sword Beach that is due out soon. And he is looking to help us out to gain a broader understanding of what happened on the far eastern sector of the Normandy landing beaches. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in Stephen right now. Stephen, how's it going, man?
Very good, thank you. You?
Yeah, doing well. Doing well. Appreciate you jumping in and really kind of on short notice, to be honest, and to talk a little bit more about Sword Beach. Before we do that, the thumbnail that I used for this video, I went onto your Twitter page and found like the only picture of you that exists on the internet. You've been on World War II TV like 2 or 3 times, and I didn't want to just rip something off from Paul. So the picture that I found of you, though, I looked at it, and there were penguins in the background. And then I looked at the little sidebar thing with the information. I'm like, holy cow, this dude was just in Antarctica not too long ago. What were you doing down there?
I work on expedition ships for a company called Lindblad and National Geographic. And these are small cruise ships, if you like. They're about 120 guests we have on board each time. And we sail to various destinations around the world. And I get to talk about history, all of these different places we go to. And yeah, I know the picture you're referring to. In that picture, I'm driving a Zodiac around in St. Andrews Bay, I think it is, in South Georgia, which is just north of Antarctica.
It's an epic looking photo.
Yeah, that's why I picked it. I kind of liked it. I keep changing my pictures around now, but yeah, one of the guests in my Zodiac snapped a picture of me with the penguins in the background, and I thought, oh, that just looks really good.
So you're an archaeologist and historian by trade, right?
Yes. So in the UK, I practice archaeology and historical research as a freelancer for a variety of different organizations. And then, yeah, I get to go out on these expedition ships occasionally and lecture about the history of the places we're going to and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I have quite a mix of work. Sometimes I'm doing landscape survey in our national parks and walking around woodlands and fields looking for unusual heritage features. And then I might be buried in a collection of books trying to work out the story of an individual vessel or something that we're surveying on a muddy riverbank or a boat that somebody is trying to restore or something like that.
Okay. Fascinating. So Sword Beach, you have a book. Tell me when the book is due out. It's late May sometime, right?
Yes, 23rd of May. Hang on.
Oh, okay.
I have my own copy of it now, which is
very nice. I love that cover, by the way. That cover looks so sharp.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Lord Lovett here, supposedly Lord Lovett, advancing off of his landing. Very famous picture. It has Bill Millin is this guy, but he's cropped in this one. But it wasn't space, unfortunately. Yeah, I suggested the picture, and Penguin ran with it and created this absolutely lovely cover. So I'm very grateful to them. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I can't remember what I was going to say. So
Yeah, so I was mentioning earlier that when it comes to researching things about D-Day, I mean, you can find all kinds of stuff on Omaha Beach. You can find a lot on the American airborne operations, and even a little bit on the British airborne operations.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of good stuff on Juno Beach. You get to Sword Beach, and I would even include Gold with that. The well kind of starts getting a little bit dry. So, I mean, what was it that kind of drew you to tackling Sword Beach?
Well, in my archaeology work, I've tackled a number of landing craft from D-Day and vessels, either in the intertidal zone, old wrecks in this country that have, after the war they were sold off and they've been abandoned, or there's wrecks in the English Channel that were actually sunk in the Second World War. And during the research into them, I was constantly going back and forth to our national archives in the United Kingdom to try and piece together the story of these individual vessels. What were they doing on D-Day? Who were they carrying? Where had they sailed from? Where were they due to land? And that kind of thing. And every time I did this, I kept thinking, why has this never been written down? And obviously, a lot of these were British landing craft, and they're going to the British beaches. And yeah, even just finding out the actions of individual flotillas or the individual waves on, particularly, like you say, Sword and Gold beaches was very, very difficult, because there aren't actually that many books about them. You're right. There are, I checked years ago and I was looking into it. There's basically 4 books that are specifically about Sword Beach.
In 80 years, there's 4 books.
That are specific about Sword. Now, there's obviously lots of unit histories. There's histories of the individual commando units. There's histories of individual battalions. There's the history of the 3rd Infantry Division who landed on Sword, but they're not exclusive to Sword. They are covering their entire military history through the Second World War. So a lot of them go from 1940 to 1945, and Sword Beach is just one episode or one chapter in that book. But like you say, there are dozens of books that are specifically about Omaha on the 6th of June. There's quite a few about Utah. They're on the shelves behind me. There's at least 2 proper hardback books about Juno Beach. Yeah, like you say, there's several about the airborne as well. But yeah, when you get to Sword and Gold, they're paperbacks. They're the thin. In the UK, we have Osprey publications. They're about 100 pages. Or self-guided tour books, or people's battlefield studies. At Sword and Gold, there's one battlefield study for each beach that somebody has published, or it was sort of like a very academic publication that's not something you can easily find in a bookshop. And they're quite expensive to get secondhand as well. So there's never been, a properly produced book about Sword Beach, in my opinion. Not a comprehensive one that looks at everything in more detail than just the movement of the individual battalions, saying X battalion moved to such and such a town and liberated it. And that's such a sweeping statement when that's given. This battalion captures this town, and they might give it perhaps a paragraph, but really there's so much more to say about that action of capturing a town. There's a whole chapter in that, and that's what's missing for Sword Beach. And yeah, in 80 years, nobody has written a proper hardback book about what happened at Sword Beach on the 6th of June. And I thought, oh well. Maybe I'll have a go. Originally I thought this was going to be quite a detailed publication, very comprehensive, looking at every individual unit, times, specifics, all sorts of comprehensive detail. And I think that's actually what a lot of people expected me to write. But when I started writing it, when I sat down and thought, right, let's have a go at this and see what happens, it came out very differently. And it came out more like a thriller. I was taking all of the detail that was available to me, all of the primary sources. So the reports that were filed after D-Day by the Royal Navy and by the Army, and the war diaries and the reports that they wrote for their commanders, the memoirs of people who were there and wrote their experiences down years or decades later, the oral archives that are in the Imperial War Museum collection. And I started to combine this with maps and photographs from the period to work out where units are going. And it suddenly turned into I found myself using a lot of adjectives and adverbs to describe the experiences of these men as they're making their advances into all of these different places. And it became a lot more pacey, and it has become more of a sort of dramatic book about what happened on Sword Beach. And it's all factual.
Yeah.
There's nothing made up in there. It's all the information that I can glean from those war diaries or from the personal experiences. But it stopped being this very comprehensive, dry academic book, and it became quite a pacey thriller, if you like, on the experiences on D-Day, which I think is a fair way to do it. D-Day was dramatic.
Yeah.
And so to produce it or present it in that way, I think is quite justified.
So I know that we're kind of entering into, well, we're not kind of entering into it. We are in it, where we are in the twilight years of a lot of these veterans. So within 10 to 20 years, we're going to be seeing a news report at some point about the last American World War II veteran passing away, the last British and Canadian, everything like that. Did you rely on any contemporary veteran accounts for some of the guys who were still around? I know that can get a little bit dicey.
Yeah, I decided not to quite early on, for two reasons. First, I'm terrified of talking to veterans. I don't feel like I have anything to ask them that they haven't already been asked dozens of times, and it just makes me feel incredibly awkward meeting these people and asking them questions. I just get incredibly shy when I do it. But more importantly, they've already given their experiences numerous times, and all the ones who are alive today, especially, they're celebrities essentially, and they've produced or given over their experiences in multiple different formats as oral archives or memoirs, or it's been written down. And actually, all of that information tending to be older and nearer the events is probably more comprehensive and more reliable. And as it was, I had more than enough information to go off of from the memoirs and the oral archives that people have already done. Oral archives, there was a big boom of that in the 1990s, so the 50th anniversary, and there's some really useful stuff there. And then all of these books, individual memoirs or unit histories where this stuff's been recounted. So I had more than enough available to me. And I thought, rather than go and talk to people all over again, why not just use the information they've already imparted to us?
Okay. Are there any memoirs that really stood out that kind of formed the backbone, or unit histories or anything, or was it kind of a spattering of everything that you could find?
It was a bit of a spattering, really. For Sword Beach in particular, there were some good commando memoirs. There was The Fuel of the Fire by Douglas Grant, who was the support the support troop for 41 Royal Marine Commando, the commanding officer of that troop.
Okay.
He wrote a very visceral account of his experience on D-Day as 41 Commando tried to capture the small seaside town of Lyon-sur-Mer on the right flank, so the western flank of the Allied landings. That was a brilliant memoir. Of course, it covers more than just D-Day. It covers his whole war.
Sure.
But written pretty viscerally. It's his personal experience. He didn't get bogged down in what the rest of his unit was doing. I suspect he wrote it without the benefit of a war diary or any other point of reference. He literally just sort of wrote down what had happened to him. It's a really good read, actually. Other ones. Of famous people, you have Bill Millin, the piper. He wrote down his memoir in the 1990s. I think it's just called D-Day.
Okay.
Google Bill Millin memoir, and I think it's just called D-Day or maybe Overlord. And Mills Roberts, the commander of 6 Commando, he left a very good memoir called Clash by Night. And his memoir is very good. And I visited the archive collection, all of his papers in London, in one of the archives there, and all the papers he used to write his book, including his first draft as well. He used everything that was available to him. He used the unit war diary, reports filed by his subordinate officers, and then went and interviewed other people while he was writing his book. So his memoir is very comprehensive, very full of historical detail. So, you know, a complete difference to Douglas Grant's, which is just his personal experience. So yeah, Clash by Night by Mills Roberts is very good.
Okay. I imagine your work as an archaeologist came into play a little bit going to the archives. There's kind of like a little paper archaeology that's going on there to try and dig up these old records that I'm assuming not many people had made use of, since there's only 4 books on Sword Beach in 80 years.
Yeah, there's all sorts of paperwork in the National Archives, and the National Archives is absolutely brilliant. But the records of each folder, you'll usually get a 1-sentence description of what a folder or a file is. So you go and look at record number ADM 17521 or something, and it would say records of Force S D-Day, and that's just 1 sentence. But when you get there, it's a file about this thick, 300-400 pages, and it contains everything you could ever hope to ever see. Individual flotilla reports from every unit, the fleet orders, the bombardment ship logs, and that sort of thing. So yeah, sometimes you have no idea what you're going to find when you order a file at the National Archives, and sometimes it's literally just a little folio with 5 pieces of paper in it. You're kind of disappointed when you get it, and then other times it's practically a book in its own right. And at Sword in particular, it's immensely helpful, the naval reports in particular.
Okay.
Because the naval commanders, Rear Admiral Talbot and Commander Bush, who commanded the assault wave, they made an extra special effort to try and gather as many comprehensive reports from their flotilla commanders as they could in the weeks after D-Day while the memories were fresh. So they compiled this excellent report.
Okay. Were you able to pull anything from the German archives or German sources?
A little bit, yeah. So German archives, I didn't go, but fortunately some very kind people sent me some very useful documents, particularly the naval records, which was very useful in reconstructing the attack by the 5th German torpedo boat flotilla under the command of Heinrich Hoffmann, who launched the torpedo attack in the early hours of D-Day that sank one of the British destroyers. So that was very, very useful. And then there's quite a few German accounts that are available as well. When Cornelius Ryan wrote The Longest Day, he managed to track down numerous German individuals, and they wrote down their experiences for him, and they're all now available in the US archives, and many of them are in the Cornelius Ryan archive are online as well. So there's stuff like that. Then there's all of the work that the Allies did interviewing numerous people after the war had ended. They interviewed many senior commanders, brigade and divisional commanders, to get their take on what had happened in Normandy in 1944. So there's some very good stuff there from the divisional commanders. And then there's also prisoner of war records. So after we captured German infantrymen and shipped them back to England to the prisoner of war cages, many of them were interviewed. They're not comprehensive, really. They're trying to get intelligence out of them. They're trying to find out, you know, what various strong points further over the coast are like, and that sort of thing. But they were interviewing quite often, trying to find out how they were captured and the circumstances of their capture, and that could add a little bit more detail to the German accounts as well. So yeah, there's a fair bit of German stuff. I wanted to make sure that there were German and French perspectives in the book as well. But of course, being British, it is a British-led narrative.
Sure, absolutely. So let's talk about Sword Beach for a little bit. When you look at the 5 different landing beaches, to me, each one poses a unique challenge to the Allies. Like Utah Beach, the Germans have flooded the fields inland, and you have these narrow causeways that they have to go in. Omaha Beach, it's the terrain. You got these bluffs with the narrow draws that are heavily defended. Juno Beach, it's a lot of urban combat. For the British who are coming in at Sword, what are they looking at as they are coming in? What challenges are they facing?
Sword is a a very well defended beach. So the landing area at Sword, one of the biggest challenges they have is it's very narrow because it's stuck between this sort of offshore sandbank over on the west side, which limits the ability of landing craft to get up to the shore. So Obo was out because there's shallow cliffs there. Peter, very much the same. It's the sandbanks offshore that make it difficult. Roger faces right onto Weestrum. So that's a very urban area, obviously going to be well defended, but also it limits the ability to get off the beach because you then have urban sprawl immediately behind it. So the main landing area was Queen, and it was just red and white beaches. So the landing area at Sword could only be 1 mile wide, which is very narrow.
Wow.
If you look at Omaha, that's 3.5 miles wide, the landing area, and a little bit more if you include Ponta Hoc. So because of that, because of the narrowness of the beach, it restricted the operation to get the troops ashore. So at Gold and Juno beaches, they're much wider. They have the ability to land 2 brigades at the same time. So it's a 2-brigade front. But at Sword Beach on Queen Red and White, there's only space to land 1 brigade at a time. So it limits your operations. It limits the number of men you can put ashore at the same time. And it means that you have a much narrower beachhead from which to expand and spread out. And that 1 mile of beach was also still very, very well defended. So in the middle of it was Strong Point Weedlestrandle Nest number 20, which is probably one of the largest single strong points on the entire Normandy beach area for D-Day.
Wow.
As a single fortification, it's about the size of a football pitch or an American football pitch. A complex network of trenches connecting various concrete bunkers, anti-tank gun positions, mortar positions, machine gun nests, and all surrounded by barbed wire. And it sits almost right in the middle of the landing area. And then you've got flanking positions over on the east and the west sides, and then all of these houses that you can see in the photo. This is over on the west side of Sword Beach. All of these houses have been fortified as well, so there's gun positions inside them. They're blocked up, and there's barbed wire between all of them as well. So blocking every exit off the beach is a barbed wire sort of nest, if you like. So Sword Beach was pretty well defended, and not a lot of people realize this, but after the fighting, intelligence units went ashore to look at the strength of the defenses across all 5 beaches, and it's not highly scientific. They used various different measures to work out a sort of average or mean defense level, if you like. But what's interesting is that roughly mile for mile, if you took the average number of defenses per mile on Omaha Beach, it's the same as on Sword for that 1 mile. The average number of machine guns and mortars and anti-tank guns is roughly the same. It's not hugely scientific. They try to take a mean number of defenses by equivalenting mortars to machine guns and that sort of thing. It's all a bit lies, damned lies, and statistics in a way. But Sword Beach was just as well defended as Omaha in many ways. The difference at Omaha, of course, is you have the bluffs behind, which, like you say, the terrain makes a big difference. But at Sword, you had a lot more houses, a lot more strong points that the Germans could defend. And yeah, it was harder to get off the beach because it's blocked by this sort of urban line in front of it. So it had its own peculiar set of problems.
Well, the beaches at Sword Beach, when I've been there, which obviously hasn't been as much as you, it seemed like they don't have the depth either that you have at Omaha. Like at low tide at Omaha, it's like 300 yards up to the seawall, but Sword is a little bit less depth, right?
Yeah, it's a very shallow gradient at Sword, so the tide will come in very quickly.
Okay.
Because it's almost flat in a way. And so as soon as the tide starts to spring up, it will flood that beach very, very quickly. And that was a big problem that they had at Sword as well, along with the weather and this storm that had struck the channel the day before, which of course had caused D-Day to be delayed by 24 hours. That pushed the water right up the beach very, very quickly. And the tide came in much faster than was expected and was planned. And so that created chaos as well, because all of the beach obstacles, in your last photo, you saw all of the tetrahedron and the Czech hedgehogs and all of those. This is at Franceville Plage. This is about 3-4 miles to the east, but it's very similar to what you would have seen at Sword Beach. All of those obstacles were very quickly immersed in water, and that means that the landing craft then have to navigate between them to get the troops onto the beach. And a lot of the time they couldn't, so they just rammed them. But that slows you down. It makes it harder for the landing craft to withdraw. So with the tide pushing in as quickly as it did, yeah, that made it even harder to get troops onto the beach. And then you end up with traffic jams on the beach because there's no room for the vehicles that are unloading to maneuver, because the beach has narrowed to a very narrow strip between the houses and the waterline.
That's what I was getting ready to ask. You have a 1 mile wide beach and 150-yard beachhead. Yeah, I would think that it's going to get a little crowded in a hurry, which could cause all kinds of problems.
Yeah, and it was less than 150 yards pretty quickly as well.
Oh, yeah.
About 11 o'clock, it's down to maybe 100 yards, less than that, probably 80 yards perhaps. So yeah, it made it incredibly difficult. And because the strength of the resistance was strong enough to slow down the attackers, trying to clear the lanes off the beach between the houses to get to the road inland was a lot harder, and it took a long time to open up those exits. And so you have a lot of tanks stuck on the beach because there's no way to get off. They're being mortared and shelled by batteries inshore. There's the 2 flanking strong points are still firing on the beach quite a lot. So it made it a very dangerous place to be, basically, while all of these units were struggling to get off. And this is, of course, after the initial fight to capture the beach, which was no easy task for the assault battalions. And they came in under very, very heavy fire when they made their initial landing. So for the first half hour on Sword Beach, it's very heavy fighting to try and neutralize those initial strong points. And even then, Strongpoint Cod, the Wiedelstrandel Nest number 20, Cod was its British code name. Okay. That was active for several hours.
Wow. And so H hour at Sword Beach is about an hour later than Omaha, right?
Yeah, so Omaha was
that coming into play at all?
Omaha was 6:30 and Utah as well. And then on the British beaches, Gold and Sword, it was 7:25. It was going to be the same at Juno, but they delayed it a little bit because of this offshore sandbar that they needed a little bit more tide over. So Juno was the last beach. But yeah, 7:25, just under an hour after the first landings at Omaha and Utah.
I would think that would be a factor as well. I mean, if my neighbor down the street is having somebody raid his house and it's an hour before my house is about to get raided, I'm going to probably, with the heads up, defend, get myself ready for what's coming. Plus, you've all got the airborne landings that are happening behind them. Is that coming into play at all as far as their preparedness and getting ready for the troops coming in?
To a certain extent, yes. Okay. And then in another way, no. So, yeah, it certainly gave the Germans a heads up, like you say, but ultimately there wasn't a huge amount they could do about it, because although the German defensive positions were very strong, the number of infantry actually manning them was fairly small, because in Sword sector, you only have 1 infantry division to defend Sword, but also Juno and Gold, 716 infantry division, and they're not a big division. They've only got 2 brigades or 2 regiments rather than 3, which is the normal size in an Allied army. So they're very spread out, and there's not that many troops on the beach. And then there are troops inland, but it's quite hard to get them forward in time, because although, like you say, the analogy of your neighbor's house being raided, you're never sure which house is going to be raided next. So where do you put your troops? And this was the problem that the commanders back in Caen faced as well, when they're trying to work out which bits do they reinforce. So they had 21st Panzer Division, the only Panzer Division near the beaches on D-Day, and they were all largely deployed south of Caen. And when they were given permission to move at 6 o'clock in the morning, they weren't sure where to send them, so they sent them into the British airborne area to try and counter the landings that have been made overnight there. But that actually takes them away from Sword Beach, because it takes them up to the east side of the Caen Canal, east of Pegasus Bridge, and the River Orne, because they don't know that there's going to be a landing at Sword yet. They can't predict that much ahead. So they put all of their eggs into one basket and send them over to the airborne area, which is sensible. That's where the enemy definitely are. But then come midday, they realize, there's all of these amphibious landings happening due north of Caen. Actually, we need to go and counter them because you've got armor coming on the beaches. The airborne don't have that, so they're less of a threat. So suddenly they have to redeploy all of their units that have headed towards the airborne sector back across the Caen Canal and the River Orne to counter the landings at Sword. But of course, you can't use Pegasus Bridge. It's been captured. So they had to go back into Caen and across the bridges there and through all of the chaos of those streets that have been bombed earlier in the day. So it takes a long time for that Panzer division to respond to what's happening at Sword.
Okay. Now, to the east of Sword Beach is this mysterious sixth beach of Normandy, Band Beach. I had a video where I went there, and there's quite a few bunkers over there. Were those coming into play as far as flanking fire for the troops that are coming in on Sword, or was that a non-factor?
Most of the individual bunkers at Franceville Plage didn't have the range to hit the forces that are landing at Sword.
Okay.
What you did, of course, have was Merville Battery, which had been attacked by the British Airborne overnight and largely neutralized. Merville does appear to have fired on D-Day later in the afternoon, but it was a severely weakened battery by this point, and its fire was very sporadic and not very effective. So, you do have all of these other units. You also have another division across the other side of the river as well, which is eventually brought into action. But they don't have a huge effect on what's happening.
Okay.
What you do have, though, is the big coastal batteries. As well as Merville, you have the batteries up at Houlgate and further up the coast, and they had to be neutralized. So they're bombed in the early hours of D-Day. And then you have Force D, the bombardment squadron of the big battleships, Warspite, Ramillies, the Monitor, Roberts. They're all there accompanying Force S, the naval task force, to bombard these positions and neutralize them basically before they can fire on the fleet.
Okay.
They're the biggest threat from what's on the other side of the Orne.
Okay. Now on the British side, who is coming in on D-Day? Are these like fresh troops who have never seen combat before, or are there some veteran elements that have maybe been in North Africa or Dunkirk or Sicily, or who are we looking at coming in on the British side?
And on the British beaches, you have a mix of units. On Gold Beach, you have the 50th Infantry Division. They are desert rats. They've got experience in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. But over on Sword Beach, you have the 3rd Infantry Division, and they had been largely quiet during the war. They fought in France in 1940. Their divisional commander, in fact, was Montgomery. And when they withdrew from Dunkirk, they got back to the United Kingdom. They were instantly re-equipped to be the fighting division. Briefly, this intention that they would go back into France via Normandy, but that's all shelved as the general withdrawal back to the UK happens. And then as the only effective fighting division, they were ready to counter any invasion throughout the rest of 1940. Of course, that never comes. And they spend the rest of the war in training. Then there's the possibility they might go to Dieppe, and even the possibility they might take part in some of the Mediterranean fighting, but each time they keep getting stopped at the last minute and another division takes their place. So when D-Day starts the planning in earnest begins for D-Day in 1943, they are chosen to be one of the assault divisions. And all of the training that they've put into practice, of course, then starts to bear fruit because they've spent a long time training. There are various different opinions on this. Some people writing after the war said that they felt that the division was overtrained. So they'd spent too long training and they weren't ready to then be more what's the word? They're too comprehensively trained and weren't spontaneous enough when it came to actual fighting. One of the criticisms leveled at them. And yeah, some people said they trained too hard and hadn't seen enough combat. But the main bulk of the division, at least two of the brigades, were veterans from France in 1940. I often find it odd that people will say, "Oh, well, 3rd British Infantry Division, they'd had too much training. They'd done all this training, but they'd never actually fought." The same can be said of 101st Airborne Division.
Yeah.
And nobody says that they were overtrained. So, yeah, there's a curious conflict there. But yeah, essentially, they had spent an awful long time in the UK. They weren't as battle hardened as other units. But equally, I would say that gave them a bit of an edge in that they hadn't, like other divisions had been, and like 101st Airborne Division were later in the war, they were more willing to take risks. They weren't quite as wary of operations at that stage.
Yeah, I've seen veteran accounts and have talked to veterans myself who said that the things that they did early in combat when they first went in, they looked back on it and thought, what was I even thinking? Like they become more cautious as their experience grows.
Yeah, which makes complete sense.
Oh, I would too. You start thinking about that you're playing the odds, and how many times are you going to get lucky? I guess you could say.
When you're going to push your luck. Yeah,
exactly. Now, probably, I think it would probably be fair to say that when it comes to Sword Beach, the connection that most people would have would be the story of Lord Lovett and Piper Millen coming in, which was popularized in the film The Longest Day. But I just recently took a group of students, high school students, to Normandy, and most of them had never even seen Saving Private Ryan. So, so I'm guessing that they probably haven't seen The Longest Day either. What was the story with Lovett and Piper Millen? Because they're both pretty colorful characters.
Yeah, they've both become legendary figures, I think partially as a result of The Longest Day. And I think what's interesting about them is their story tends to dominate Sword Beach now. Yeah. And yeah, The Longest Day hasn't helped that, where you get this scene of them coming ashore and there's sporadic fire. There's a bit of machine gun fire, a bit of shelling, but compared to what's happening on Omaha, it's much, much easier. And they walk up the beach and they meet a Frenchman who toasts them with champagne, and then they march off inland. And later on, they liberate Pegasus Bridge. And unfortunately, I think that seems to have become the sort of story of Sword Beach. And people assume, based on that it wasn't that difficult. They kind of came ashore and just moved inland immediately. And yeah, everyone has visions of the troops get ashore and then Lovett and Millen, his piper, alongside him, piping the way, lead the advance on Pegasus Bridge. And that's not really what happened at all. Obviously, they were there and they did land. And actually, the landing that's depicted in The Longest Day is broadly accurate for what happens when Lovett and Millen come ashore.
Okay.
Because they come ashore 90 minutes after the assault waves. They're much later in the landing period. So unfortunately, The Longest Day skips all of the combat fighting on Sword Beach and goes straight to Millen and Lovett coming ashore. Well, and actually, when I then looked into Lovett's story, again, you have this impression of him marching at the front of a column that makes its way to Pegasus Bridge. And that wasn't really the case either. They were led by 6th Commando. And Mills Roberts, whose memoir Clash by Night I mentioned earlier, they're the ones who led the advance inland for about 4 or 5 miles through urban areas, woodland, marshes, clearing the way for the commandos to then follow up. And theirs is the more interesting story. And again, a story that I don't think has been properly told. It's mentioned in books, but like I say, in a sentence usually. And Mills Roberts goes into great detail in his memoir, of course, which was very helpful in writing that chapter. But yeah, there's actually this whole story of a commando unit cutting through the Normandy countryside to reach Pegasus Bridge, all sorts of actions that they're involved in, overcoming strong points and snipers and that sort of thing. So there's a far more interesting story beyond Lovett and Millen making their way off the beach and down the country lanes.
Yeah, but none of them are wearing a sweater or playing the bagpipes, so you don't so we don't get to hear about them.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, Longest Day has a lot to answer for there, doesn't it? Lovett and his white sweater and his hunting rifle, neither of which is true. Yeah.
So you have the Americans on Utah and Omaha, the Canadians on Juno, British on Gold and Sword, but this is a broader operation than just those three countries. It's really a multinational assault that's happening. We also have the French coming in on Sword Beach.
So there's 2 troops of French commandos that are attached to 4 commando that are landing at about half an hour after the assault wave. And the French commandos are the first commandos to go ashore. And there's 177 of them attached to the 500 or so men of 4 commando. And their mission is to attack the town of Ouistreham, the port town on the eastern side of the landings. 4 commando have to neutralize the gun battery, the big coastal battery there, and the French troops are attached, and they're given independent objectives in Ouistreham to support this attack as well. And yeah, again, the coverage tends to focus on the French commandos, and again, we can blame the Longest Day for that, and their attack on Port-en-Bessin instead of Ouistreham. But again, theirs is only part of the story. And 4 commandos' attack on the battery is equally as interesting and equally as dramatic.
Okay.
And what's interesting about the attack on Ouistreham is it's the only piece of proper urban fighting on D-Day, because none of the other units that come ashore, save the Canadians attacking villages, and of course they do land directly in front of Courcelles, but Courcelles was a much, much smaller village then than it is now. It didn't have that waterfront urban area. But this was proper urban fighting. And this is the reason that whilst most of the commandos wore their green berets, 4 commando wore their helmets on D-Day because they were going into an urban fighting area.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So yeah, there's an interesting story. And in fact, after I got the contract to write this book, it was the first chapter I wrote was the attack on Ouistreham, and what I've now called the Battle of Ouistreham, because it's significant enough to be considered its own battle, its own engagement, really. And again, one that hasn't really been written about properly. There is a good book on the history of 4 Commando. They cover it, but of course it's covering 4 Commando through the entire war again, so it's slightly less detailed. So yes, the French troops play an absolutely crucial role in that, and they get very comprehensive coverage in my book. I scoured the archives, and Ian Deere, who wrote the book 10 Commando, all about the foreign national units that were in the British commandos. He left a very comprehensive archive of all of his research in the Imperial War Museum, and that was very, very useful content. Lots of interviews with French commandos, lots of their reminiscences, pictures, all sorts of stuff. But yeah, they weren't the only foreign troops at Sword Beach. You also had the Navy, and you had Norwegian Navy there as well. There were 2 Norwegian destroyers. There was a Polish cruiser and a Polish destroyer. And then you have the Americans as well. 8th Air Force is the unit that bombs the beach just before the landings go in. And their mission is to attack all of these strong points on the beach and inland from the air. So 8th Air Force and indeed 100th Bomber Group, Masters of the Air, they bomb Ouistreham about 20 minutes before the landings. So they're actually present at Sword Beach on D-Day.
Oh, wow. Is there any, in the Allied planning, any, I guess, does the fact that it's an urban area where people are living, does that factor into the plans at all? Or is it just we got to do what we got to do and blast through it, and whatever happens, happens.
Yeah, the latter.
Okay. That's what I was afraid of.
Pretty much, yeah. I don't think that there was much they could hope to do. They couldn't risk pre-warning French civilians because that could give the game away very easily.
Sure.
What they did do was leaflet drop Caen. So when the 8th Air Force, and it's 3rd Bomb Division of the 8th Air Force, the bombing sword sector, when they bomb Caen I think it's about 8 o'clock in the morning, they also leaflet drop with lots and lots of leaflets saying, leave the town, get out while you can, to pre-warn the French population that the bombers will come back. So they bombed it once and they drop a load of leaflets along with it, but they go back several times that day, as do the British. So there's only so much you can do to pre-warn them. Obviously, at that point, the game is up anyway. They've already landed. So
right, yeah. I was getting ready to say, by that point, anybody when the landing happens at Sword Beach, you know what the next target is, or what the big objective is.
And of course, it was really just to say the bombers will be back. It doesn't say we will make a strategic strike on land at this target. But I think the Germans would have guessed that by then anyway. Like you say, that the next target is obvious. So yeah, there wasn't a huge amount that could be done about French civilians, and there were many French civilian casualties, of course, as a result, unfortunately. But yeah, there's only so much pre-preparation or pre-warning that could be given.
Were you able to find any French accounts from the who were there to any degree?
Yeah, again, it's other authors who have done it in the past. I forget the author's name. He wrote Countdown to D-Day, and he interviewed several survivors from Weestrum, people who had been very badly injured and were evacuated by the British afterwards to treat their wounds, in fact. And so I was able to include some of those accounts in. And again, they left quite detailed accounts of how the war had affected them and their experience at D-Day. So that was useful. And there's been a couple of books by French authors. They took a lot longer for me to translate, obviously, so there's less of them in there. But yeah, there are some useful accounts from French publications. But I confess they're not the main aim of the story. So there's only a few.
Sure. So we're approaching an hour here, and I want to be respectful of your time. And I know that you're traveling tomorrow, so you probably want to pack at some point. Your book, is it only available in the European market first, and then later in America?
Hopefully later in America, yeah. So I'm a new British author writing about a British beach. So we haven't had a huge amount of interest from America yet, but that may change. And you can order it from the UK to get it over in the States. And like I said, it does have some American accounts in it. So I pulled out quite a few accounts from 100th Bomb Group and other bomb groups in the 3rd Bombardment Division for their bombing mission over Sword Beach on D-Day. Walter Cronkite, he bombed Caen, or rather he was on the plane that was attacking Caen. So there's sorts of accounts in there. But yeah, it is primarily a British beach, and so most of the accounts, of course, are British. But I managed to get in accounts from the French, the Germans, the French civilians, the Americans, a couple of Norwegians, Poles as well. So there's a mix in there.
Well, I mean, for any Americans who are watching or listening to this, I would argue that if you don't know the stories of the British and Canadian beaches, you don't know the story of Normandy and the Battle of Normandy. You're only getting a limited perspective. I'm super thankful that you've done the work and have put out this book. I think I saw something that you reposted a while back on Twitter where maybe even some British people don't completely understand Sword as well. There was a museum, I think, that posted a picture of a map of Sword Beach, and in the caption at the museum, it said that here's a map of Sword Beach, which was lightly defended on D-Day. It's like, no, it's the most heavily defended place on D-Day, and a lot of people just don't know.
I won't name the museum, but
no, I won't either.
Exactly
we won't call it out here, but
yeah, and that's the unfortunate problem that Sword Beach has been swallowed up by the bigger events of D-Day, because you've got so much happening on D-Day that attention inevitably gets drawn to the usual stories, I suppose, and Omaha Beach, obviously, the airborne, the Canadians at Juneau, and then when you count Sword, it's Lovett, like I said. And I've argued many times, if Sword had happened in complete isolation, it would be worthy of numerous books. This is a successful amphibious landing against a very well-defended piece of coastline. It faces the only armoured counterattack in the entire beach area on D-Day itself from 21st Panzer Division. None of the other beaches have to deal with armour to the same extent. And it was incredibly important operation to secure the flanks of the landings and connect with 6th Airborne Division and support the rest of the landings on the eastern flank. So had it happened in isolation, I think there would be hundreds of books about it, just like there are hundreds of books about a single division at Arnhem, the 1st Airborne Division. But because it is part of this much bigger event that is D-Day, it's swallowed up and sort of absorbed into that bigger story. And so the detail has never really come out in the same way.
Well, I appreciate the work that you've done to give us that detail and give us a fuller picture of what happened on D-Day. Is there a Gold Beach book that we can maybe expect at some point?
I think everyone would like me to, and I can't deny that like everything I've said about Sword Beach, the lack of literature about it and the various stories that are overlooked or simplified to a single sentence, it all applies to Gold as well. I need to have some conversations, but I'd very much like to tackle Gold.
Okay, awesome. Well, hey, it's looking increasingly more likely that I'll be at We Have Ways Fest this year. Maybe. Are you going to be there?
Yes, I'm there on the Friday afternoon, and I'll be speaking at 3:00 on the main stage, the HQ tent, all about Sword Beach, and I'll do a sort of feature presentation on the Battle of Ouistreham, in fact, and outline how that battle unfolded, but also how I combined all of these accounts to explain what happens there, how I match images with memoirs and film footage that was shot by Army Film and Photographic Units, with the official record, the war diaries and reports that were filed at the time. So I can sort of explain how I constructed the book as I did.
Awesome. Well, hey, I'll be looking forward to that, and I'm probably going to buy a bunch of your books and put them in an empty suitcase and bring them back to the U.S. so I can sell it on the black market. Well, hey, thanks for carving out a little bit of time to chat with us and help us learn a little bit more about Battle of Sword Beach. Anything before we go?
No, thank you for having me. I'm always very happy to talk at length about it. So my guests on this next expedition I'm doing, leaving tomorrow, are going to get bored to tears about Sword Beach. So over dinner and cocktails, there'll be endless Sword Beach conversation, I'm sure.
Awesome. Well, they're lucky. All right, man. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. Cheers.